We'll try not to fall asleep. Fortunately for everyone, we've got one of the most entertaining presenters after lunch. It's my great honor to introduce our next speaker. He's a dear friend. We were just chatting about this actually. This is his 10th year being here with us as a Bronze Buffalo Club member, participant, and more importantly, a brother to us. Paul is an adjunct professor at McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University, where he teaches an interdisciplinary macro seminar titled Law, Money, and Financial Macrodynamics. He created that previously at the law school at Cornell University. As many of you guys know, prior to Paul's retirement in 2010, he had a long and distinguished career at PIMCO, where he was the managing director and portfolio manager before he became the economist of PIMCO. So without further ado, please welcome to the stand Paul McCulley. Thank you.
Thanks, Cody. It is fantastic to be back here in Teton Springs. It just brings me serenity to be here, and also brings me hugs from the Heights brothers, which just amplifies the joy of being here, and lots of dear friends. I'm not going to talk too much about the markets today, and I actually want to discuss political economy, as I have a number of times over the years here. And I want to start by saying I deeply appreciated Paul Ryan this morning. Deeply appreciated Paul Ryan this morning. And I say that as a flaming liberal Democrat. All of you who know me, I've always been a flaming liberal Democrat. And why I so deeply appreciated Paul this morning is I got an answer to a question that I've been asked increasingly in recent years, and particularly in the last year, is what is the Republican Party? What is the Republican Party? And I thought Paul articulated the architecture of what the Republican Party should be. Not what it is, but what it should be going forward. Because I fundamentally believe that our two-party system needs to be robust. I'm actually a believer in bipartisanship, which maybe means I'm not quite as a flaming liberal as where my own party has gone in recent years. I think it is incredibly constructive for us as a society to have a robust two-party system where we can define each other. Define the way of thinking that each party brings to the public square. And the public square is where we make decisions collectively as a country. And in that public square, there are two fundamental governance systems. And I believe in both. And I think this room believes in both. They're called democracy and capitalism. I'm a fervent believer in capitalism. And Paul articulated that. And I could give his speech with passion because I believe it on that portion. The beauty and the glory of capitalism. I have never been a socialist and never will be a socialist. I believe in capitalism. That's a governance system. Governance for private enterprise. For private enterprise. I believe in it, and I think it is the wonder working power of prosperity through a process of creative destruction, of constantly, through the process of the incentives of capitalism, of pushing the frontier of knowledge, technology, and know-how. A system founded on the proposition, if you have a really bright idea, you can get rich. And if you have a really boneheaded idea, you have a duty to go broke. That is capitalism at its finest, and I believe in it. And at its core, it's a governance system. If you had to summarize on a bumper sticker that core guiding principle, it's $1, if we wanted to speak globally, we would say one monetary unit. Well, let's say $1, one vote. Capitalism is inherently a cumulative voting system. The more dollars you have, the more votes you have. That's a cumulative voting system. And there's nothing wrong with it with respect to the system of capitalism. You couldn't run it any other way. The big seats on a plane cost more than the little seats. How do we ration between the big seats and the little seats? Is the dude with more dollars gets a bigger seat. Nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's essential and existential to the process of resource allocation. So I'm starting with an ode to capitalism because I fundamentally believe in its wonder-working power of prosperity. And if we ever lose sight of that as a country, then we have shot ourselves not just in the foot, but in the future of our children. So count me in the same camp as Paul on the virtues and the glory of capitalism. That's a governance system, but remember, at its core, it starts with the proposition of a cumulative voting system. $1, one vote. On the other side of our society, a word I increasingly use, I like to say society, we have this governance system called democracy. And I will yield to no one in my core belief in the virtues of democracy. But it is fundamentally different than capitalism. If capitalism is $1, one vote, the equivalent in democracy is one person, one vote. One person, one vote. The guiding principle is categorically different. One person, one vote is in many respects saying the same thing as all men and women are created equal. That we have a equal natural endowment from a higher power, some would say, of inalienable rights. Inalienable rights. A just system. An egalitarian system. If you wanted to be cynical, saying a socialist system. I don't like saying the S word anymore. But in democracy, when you go behind that curtain to vote, your vote and your gardener's vote are exactly equal. It's not like when you get on the plane, you got more dollars in your pocket than your gardener, and you get a big seat. And if you have lots and lots of dollars, you get a private plane. It's not an egalitarian system. You're not all created equal in the capitalist system, and you can't be, or else you could not constructively do the process of creative destruction. But in democracy, we start with the proposition of one person, one vote. The business of managing our society is finding the right mix between these two governing systems, which is why I think it is so incredibly important that we have a robust two-party system with a clearly articulated viewpoint, which at the end of the day is about how do you weight the two governing systems. How much weight do you put on the power of capitalism, and how much weight do you put on the power of democracy? Put differently, how much weight do you put on efficiency, and how much weight do you put on equity? Put yet another way, how much weight do you put on maximizing the size of the economic pie versus how much weight do you put on the distribution of the slices of the economic pie? And our shared goal as a citizenry is to have the biggest pie possible distributed in the most just slices as possible. That should be the center of our political discourse. If that is the center, we want the biggest pie possible distributed most justly as possible, then we can have civil discussions. We have an architecture for discussions, and God forbid we have an architecture for this thing called compromise, for bipartisanship. So that's where I start today, and I feel encouraged when I listen to Paul, because he and I could have this discussion incredibly easily. What weight do we put on efficiency versus what weight do we put on equity? We want both. So we're arguing or debating about means to a shared end. Sometimes I refer to our combo of these two systems of capitalism and democracy as a holy marriage of incompatibility. And each of those words is important. When I say holy, that means I like it. It is a good marriage between the two. A holy marriage of incompatibility, which is simply reflecting the fact there's supposed to be tension in the marriage because you have two different governing principles. $1, one vote, one person, one vote. You can't put those two together without tension. You can't put together efficiency and equity without tension. So it's incompatible, but it's holy because the two systems need each other. Capitalism needs democracy for a very simple proposition. Capitalism can't function without a credible, enforceable rule of law. Capitalism founded on contracts. That's all Wall Street is real-time trading of contracts, legal contracts of a whole variety. Capitalism could not function without a framework, a playground, if you will, of a enforceable, credible, enforceable rule of law. And capitalism cannot do that itself. I started talking about the wonder working power of capitalism. It is wonderful. But capitalism inherently cannot build and establish a credible rule of law because the sheer logic of capitalism as a government system would mean that any given law system would evolve and then devolve to the proposition that you get the best justice money can buy. And that simply doesn't work. Capitalism needs a rule of law that is believable and has buy-in by the citizenry. And democracy can do that because it's founded on the proposition of one person, one vote, equality of human rights, and the one-liner, nobody is above the rule of law, which makes it believable. That is democracy's gift to capitalism, which is absolutely marvelous. We reflect back to, for those of us old enough, when the Soviet Union broke up and they said they were going to move to a capitalist system. There was no credible rule of law. It didn't work. So a credible rule of law is the gift of democracy to capitalism. And that rule of law, because it comes through the one person, one vote dictum is going to put a big weight on equity, or if you want to use a modern day expression, social justice. So democracy's gift to capitalism comes not so much with the price tag, though a cynical capitalist could say it's a price tag. It comes with a condition, which is that private market capitalism must conduct itself in a way that passes a smell test of social justice. And sometimes that means that the invisible hand of capitalism is going to have the visible fist of government pounding on its head. That's part of the deal. So effectively, our government is trying to figure out how to put the weights on the invisible hand versus the visible fist. I've talked a lot about democracy because it gives the gift to capitalism that capitalism could not organically create itself. Now, let's give capitalism its fair due. Capitalism's gift to democracy is efficiency. There is absolutely nothing like the incentive system of capitalism, which is known as the creative destructive process, to create prosperity. Democracy could never compete with the prosperity creating power of capitalism, because democracy at its core is a socialist voting system. One person, one vote. And if the far left wing of my party were to prevail, which effectively is saying, let's put all the weight on social justice and not on the power of prosperity coming from capitalism, we would turn our economy into the post office. Democracy categorically needs capitalism. And what we're doing now as a society is trying to figure out what the weights should be. What the weight should be between efficiency and equity. And that is a just political debate, one that we need to have in a constructive way in our political discourse. And right now, and here I agree with Paul's read of how things are in D.C. now, is particularly in my party, but I think also in our society, so it's not just my party, is that we have not paid enough attention over the last 40 years, 30 years, 20 years, and 10 years on equity. on equity. We have put a huge amount of emphasis on efficiency, and we've grown a really cool pie. We're the wealthiest nation on earth. So we've done really, really well on the efficiency side of things, but we as a society have not done nearly so well on equity. A big pie sliced in a way that offends the majority viewpoint, the majority smell test of social justice. So we're clearly moving in our mix between democracy and capitalism, between equity, between efficiency and equity, in a progressive direction. How fast we should go, how broad we should go, is what the debate really is about. And I also agree with Paul that President Biden has become incredibly progressive in the last 24 months, the last 12 months, and the last 6 months. Quite frankly, I think he has moved too far left. And that's the first time in my 64 years that I've said my party's leader is to the left of me. And I understand why, for political reasons, he's done that. And that is a force that's going to be with us. And actually, I applaud the right of center, which could be Republican, but also could be in my own party. In fact, I'm getting to the right of center of my party on an increasing number of issues, is try to figure out where the right balance may be. Which takes me to the issue I want to close with and leave time for questions. Over the last, which gets into monetary and fiscal policy. Which are two different policy instruments, and how we, as a democratic people, define their roles in our economy, in our society, is a matter of democratic choice. How you mix monetary and fiscal policy was not ordained by God. It is a product of political choice. How to divide the labor between the two authorities. And actually, one of the things that came out just as a wonk one-liner from the pandemic and so forth, when Jay Powell repeatedly, many, many times, he may have said it today, for all I know, is the Fed is in the lending business, not the spending business. Demarking the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy. The Fed can lend pretty much against anything, but the Fed can't spend. The Fed lends against good collateral. Now, as a practical matter, what is the dominant collateral the Fed lends against? It's actually the debt of the fiscal authority. Is the debt of the fiscal authority. There is fundamentally a difference. Fundamentally, there is no difference between a Fed liability called bank reserves and a Treasury liability called a T-bill. Both carry the full faith and credit of our government. So essentially, when the Fed buys treasuries, it is monetizing the fiscal authority's liabilities. And effectively, the Fed is spending money, creating money out of thin air, and spending it on the liabilities of the fiscal authority. It's not spending it into the economy. Literally, it is through the pipes. But from a legal perspective, what it's doing is lending to the fiscal authority, who, by the stroke of the pen of an appropriations, can spend anything that it wants to. And Jay frequently, I'm sure he did say this today, and he said it yesterday, is the spending decision is reserved for elected officials, those who are accountable to the citizenry, who are accountable to the one person, one vote system. And that's the way it should be. The Fed can print the money. They're really, really good at it. But only Congress can put the money in helicopters and send it out over the citizenry. That's a division of labor that is a function of law, the most recent being the Federal Reserve Act of 1978, which codified current arrangements. Over the last 40 years, with the exception of the period in and around the great financial crisis and then obviously during the pandemic, the Federal Reserve effectively became the fourth branch of government. And Volcker and Greenspan, I admire both men enormously, so there's nothing personal about this whatsoever. But essentially, over the last 40 years, we've lived in a regime of monetary policy dominance in the monetary fiscal policy mix. And I've, more times than I would like to remember, I have seen the fiscal authority, otherwise known as congresspeople and senators, effectively beg Alan Greenspan for permission to spend money. We can only spend money if Alan says it's okay. Because if Alan disapproves, he'll hike interest rates and punish us. So for a good chunk of my lifetime, I saw Congress, the fiscal authority, genuflect to the presumed superior power of the monetary authority, which I didn't like as a citizen, but as an economist, and more importantly in my day job as a portfolio manager, I accepted it as reality. And when you have monetary policy dominance in the mix, you will inherently have a disinflationary tailwind, particularly when monetary policy dominance operates on the doctrine of preempting inflation. Not reacting to it, but preempting inflation. Otherwise known vernacularly is taking away the punch bowl just when the party gets going good. Taking away the keg when the party gets going good. That will be disinflationary because you will cut off the boom of the economic cycle. And then when you have the inevitable downturn, inflation comes down. In fact, that process over 20, 30, 40 years ago was known as opportunistic disinflation, secular disinflation. Inflation fundamentally on a downtrend for 40 years, and therefore interest rates fundamentally on a downtrend for 40 years. That was absolutely glorious for capitalism. It meant that capital had pricing power over labor. If the monetary authority has political power over the physical authority, then capital will have pricing power over labor. And it will be a great time to be a capitalist. That was the active portion of my career. I'm not standing up here as a, preaching against something I didn't practice myself. That is going to be the outcome. But it's going to give you an income and wealth distribution outcome that flunks a test of social justice. Statistically, what it's going to give you is 40 years of capital share of national income going up relative to labor. In fact, Charlie Evans spoke about that this morning, and he was very careful about saying too much about it. But it's a practical matter. If capital share of national income is going up secularly and labor's going down, that's called disinflation. It's called disinflation. And it also is called rising income and wealth inequality, which we think in terms of, okay, that's over in your democracy bucket, Paul, I understand that. So therefore, there's going to be a payback over there. That's true. So I'm not going to push back on that. But actually, it's also a macroeconomic problem. It's a problem for capitalism itself. And sometimes when I say that to capitalists, they say, how could it be a problem if I'm getting an ever bigger slice of the pie? As long as the pie is growing, what's wrong with me getting a bigger slice? Which is another testimonial, effectively, for trickle-down economics. And it can work for a long period of time, but it fundamentally has a half-life. And there's a very simple reason for this, and John Maynard Keynes called it a fundamental psychological law, is the more you push income up the chain as opposed to down the chain, the more difficulty you have to maintain adequate, effective aggregate demand in your economy for a very simple reason. Rich people spend a lot, but have a very low marginal propensity to consume. Capitalism needs to have effective demand. So if in period one, you shift a great deal of the income, the fruits of production up the chain, you have an aggregate demand problem in period two, because there's a great deal of leakage between period one and period two into savings. There's nothing wrong with savings, but if you're shifting income up the income distribution, then it means in each successive period, 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, it's increasingly difficult to get adequate demand in the next cycle, because last cycle's income increasingly was distributed to those who have a low on the margin propensity consume. So income inequality is not just a political issue, it is a macroeconomic issue, which ultimately means there becomes a tipping point, a pivot point, where democracy has to address it, both for social justice reasons and for macroeconomic reasons, to turn the secular tide so as that labor has increasing pricing power, that labor's share of the pie goes up. And it doesn't mean that capitalists become poor. It doesn't mean that the economy goes down the plug hole. None of that has to happen whatsoever. It simply means that in a growing economy, labor is going to get a bigger slice. And if it's growing, it doesn't mean that in absolute terms the wealthy get less. They just get a smaller share of the growth. And I think that's where we're going forward. It actually makes me very optimistic if we as a country can figure out how to rearrange the weights on these two core guiding principles of efficiency, of growing as big a pie as we possibly can, and of equity, of distributing the pie in a way that passes the smell test of democratic justice and also passes a smell test of maintaining effective aggregate demand. And I think that's where we are right now, is at a major secular turning point, pivot point. And I'll give you the bottom line. Inflation is going to be higher in the next 10 to 20 years than it was in the last 10 to 20 years. And that is a good thing. That is a good thing. And it means that the Fed is no longer the disciplinarian of the fiscal authority, is no longer taking away the punch bowl on the rumor that somebody might be having a good time. Now, we obviously do not want the Fed to wait to deal with inflation pressures forever. You don't want to take away the punch bowl too soon. At the same time, you don't want to wait until half your population falls off the bar stool. You want to find some place in the middle, and I think we will find that. But we will have a mix between the central bank and the fiscal authority that will shift in the years ahead, not just because of the pandemic, but on a more enduring basis, to fiscal leadership, not monetary leadership. We won the war against inflation. Paul Volcker started it. We won it. We overwon it. We are now in the process, and the Fed is very much now in the process of declaring victory. A bit late, I think, but better that we do it now than wait any longer. Declaring victory, ditching the doctrine of preemption, and declaring that it is time for a peace dividend from the war against inflation, which we won on a secular basis, a peace dividend paid not to capital, but to labor. None of this is negative for you as capitalists. It's simply a different blending of the power of these two governance systems that we operate under, capitalism and democracy. And I will close where I started. Paul made me feel more optimistic than I was yesterday, because he articulated a framework, an architecture, an ideology, if you will, that is way to the right of me, but is also sensible and internally coherent. And that's a good thing, because that is the stuff of compromise, of bipartisanship, that can yield benefits to society at large. And I would like to think that my party can do the same. And I worry a bit about my party. I said earlier, I'm glad I can now answer what the Republican Party should be, because I saw it in Paul. And my party has got to find a similar common ground, such that, yes, the viewpoints of progressives are heard and acted upon. At the same time, that my party doesn't become hostage and captive to its progressive wing, because what really works is when we have democratic, progressive capitalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Maybe just one quick question for Paul. I know we're a little over time. But Paul, in a recent Pew survey, a majority of millennials said they preferred socialism over capitalism, or to capitalism. Do you think we need a new kind of capitalism? And if so, what should that look like? And maybe what policies would take us there?
Well, the millennials are giving socialism a really, really bad name. Actually, borrowing from a certain Republican president, we need a kinder, gentler capitalism, which actually includes a word that I cannot say in public very often because it offends too many people, but these are friends here. We need to have capitalism with more redistribution. I know, Rob, you're going to shoot me for having said that word in public, but actually, I will answer your question with a particular example that actually passes my smell test of a kinder, gentler capitalism that should also make the socialist wing of my party feel warm and fuzzy. It's called the Earned Income Tax Credit for Children, which we put into Biden's big bill for 1 year. And that's long mouthful to say earned, income tax credit. All it is a negative income tax. We would effectively, what the Democrats are really pushing for a earned income tax credit for children is a negative income tax, which means that if you don't make enough money to pay income taxes, you can still get a refund if you have children. Sounds like a negative income tax to me. And it's fascinating that we hear all the time, we got to increase the top rate. We got to increase the top rate. I'm not as negative about doing that as Paul is. I don't think it has that big a negative impact on the supply side of the economy, but I'll give him his due on it. It does have some negative impact. So effectively, the millennials who have effectively declared themselves to be socialists actually should be in favor of a new tax bracket called a negative income tax, and actually to politically sell it, and this is the delicious part of it, is that 40 years ago, none other than Milton Friedman came up with the concept and pushed it really, really hard of a negative income tax as an efficient alternative to welfare, if you will. Welfare with strings attached to it, which destroys incentives. Simply have a negative income tax, which essentially is progressive, because as you make more income, you graduate incrementally out of it, as opposed to the cliffs that you have in welfare programs. Is you get welfare up to this point and then gone. So in any event, I think that the millennials are essentially reacting to the failed smell test of social justice, but don't understand they can get what they want without effectively saying we need to throw out capitalism. You never want to throw out your cash cow. And capitalism is the cash cow of democracy, and I believe in the cash cow.
Amen. Thank you, Paul. Let's give it up for Paul McCulley one more time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Paul. And we'll turn the time back over to Scott Keller.